Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Kupiansk, and in this one the Russians have managed to enter the Sumy region through the Kursk border and start the battle over the first town to cut off the supplies going through the Sumy region and into the Ukrainian Kursk incursion in an objective to cut off the supplies for the Ukrainian forces and encircle them within the Kursk region. The Russians also managed to advance in the direction of Kupiansk on the eastern bank of the river line, the Kursk river line. They also managed to advance towards Kupiansk from the southern direction in the pocket east of Kupiansk. The Russians also managed to make several advances in the eastern section of the front line to the south of Pokrovsk within Lysivka in the direction of the highway south of Pokrovsk towards Kurakhove, west of Kurakhove capturing the remaining parts of Ulekli, and north of Velika Vasilka capturing the town of Novoocheretovate. Starting out in the south, the Russians have managed to capture the remaining parts of Novoocheretovate, and with this the Russians have gained full control over a town flanking the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. With this, the Russians will capture the fortified positions by flanking it from the weak point. Gaining full control over this back line of defense will allow them to encircle the Ukrainian forces in the defenses further south. So we see that the Russians will either manage to encircle the Ukrainian forces, or we will see a Ukrainian withdrawal from these fortified positions, or a counterattack to regain control over Novoocheretovate. In either case, the Russians have completely switched the situation around with the capture of the town, and we may see significant developments in this section. If the Russians gain full control of the fortified positions, they'll gain full control of the area in the direction all the way to Vilnepole in the west, to Novoocheretovate in the east, and this will all significantly improve the Russian positions all the way up to the fortified positions in the north, and we may see further pushes in the western direction as well to flank the fortified positions there, and further upwards towards Vesele. However, we'll likely see a redirection of forces and a focus in the eastern section where the Russians can completely bypass the next line of defense through a push through the main highway. Now that the Russians have gained full control over Ulekli following the capture of the area in between Dashne and Ulekli, the Russians will now start attacking Constantinople from three separate directions, from the eastern, northern, and southern directions, to gain full control over this town as well. And it will open the way to the flank of Ruslev and the eastern flank of Bahatir. Based on this, we'll see a general offensive by the Russian forces west of Andrivka toward the town of Oleksivka through the fortified positions and all the way to the border area near Novoukrayinka. At the same time, we'll see Russian offensive operations through the highway to the south, through Bahatir, and all the way to Komar and Perebudova, flanking the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the western outskirts of the Donetsk region, and the entire defensive line spanning from Kurakhove in the east and all the way to Kamyansk in the west through the Zaporizhia section of the front line. We also see that the Russians have managed to gain full control over the highway between Pokrovsk and Kurakhove. With full control over this highway, the Russians will now be able to properly supply their forces in both of these directions for offensive operations and connecting the two front lines better with the highway under their control. The Russians still need to create a buffer zone around the highway to prevent the Ukrainians from hitting the supply lines of the Russians with direct fire. This is taking place with the Russians flanking their positions from Andrivka in the south and Solona in the north. To the north of Zaporizhia, we see that this first line here has gone back and forth between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. The area here to the north is also under question whether the Russians still control it or not, considering the back and forth that is happening. The Ukrainians have sent some armored vehicles to reoccupy the first line, and there's a lot of back and forth, so I'm leaving it in the gray zone, and until new reports arrive here, I'm leaving it under Russian control, as there's no indication that they have recaptured it. However, there is no reports of the opposite either, so we will leave it as it is, but we see that there's a bunch of back and forth between the Russian and Ukrainian forces here north of Sripne near Zaporizhia. With the advance south of Yasenova, the Russians have also secured some first lines there for further offensive operations to secure the area in between Yasenova and Andrivka to secure the highway itself. Further north in the direction of Lysivka, the Russians made a significant advance into the northern parts of the town, as we see with the geolocated footage here. Deep State Map recently claims that they had recaptured the entirety of Lysivka just 2 days ago, But now we see that the Russians are present in the northern parts, therefore my assessment that it remained in the gray zone was correct, and we see that the Russians have moved up to the northern parts to gain control over the town. The Ukrainian defense of Lysivka is falling apart as they managed to make a counterattack towards Zelensky, but it failed and the Russians recaptured it. They took advantage of the gap in the Ukrainian defenses and managed to break through the defenses in the direction of Lysivka, capturing the majority of the town after a stalemate that lasted many months. And this presents the exact point I'm trying to make, and that is that the defense of the Ukrainians may be more effective when they constantly launch these counterattacks, but it also leaves them much more vulnerable. While they could buy a lot more time by holding their positions and not going on the counterattack, they'll be able to gain some advantages with these counterattacks, but it's also more risky, and when they fail, the Russians can take advantage of it to make their own breakthrough and break the stalemate. So see, with the Russian capture of Lysivka, their position south of Pokrovsk has significantly improved. If they manage to gain control over the fortified positions and Sumy as well, they'll be able to push onwards towards Novoukrainka and along the railways towards Pokrovsk itself from the southern direction. However, this is unlikely to happen as the Ukrainians not only have a lot of fortified positions in the area, but they also have the apartment complex area in the southern parts of the city, which is very difficult to push through for the Russian forces, and it is an extreme defensive stronghold for the Ukrainians. Instead, we'll likely see that the main axis of attack will continue to be the western flank near Peshane and Kotline, and with the loss of Lysivka, the Ukrainians will have a more difficult time defending the southern front, which means that they'll have to redirect forces from the western directions, and we're unlikely to see much more counterattacks in this direction. The Russians have made some incremental gains within Uspinivka, and therefore I have not really drawn it, but we see that they are making some small progress within the town, which indicates that they will soon gain control over it. Moving on further north, we see here in the direction of Kupiansk, the Russians managed to gain control over the majority of Kuslenikivka and the forest patch area and moved into Hrushkivka. They have regained control over the forest patch area, which the Ukrainians gained control of in a counterattack last month, where they almost regained full control over Kuslenikivka, but the Russians managed to salvage the situation and are now back on the offensive again. Similarly, to the north of Kupiansk, the Russians continue their push through Petropavlivka, gaining control over several fortified positions in the western parts of the town and entering the forest patch area to the north of Kucherivka. With this, we see that the Russians are making progress both to the north of Kupiansk but also to the south of it, and with their bridgehead across the Usk River line, we may see a combined assault by the Russian forces alongside the Usk River line to the north and to the south to gain control over the eastern and western parts of Kupiansk and all the crossings across the Usk River line to encircle the Ukrainian forces located in all of these fortified positions in the pocket here east of Kupiansk. This, combined with the recent offensive operations in the eastern parts, means that the Ukrainians are forced to spread out their forces across the entire area, and this leaves them vulnerable as they cannot defend everything at once and match up with the Russian forces who have a numerical superiority. In the Kursk Sumy region, we see that the Russians have managed to enter the Sumy region and start storming Basivka, gaining control over the northern outskirts of the town and moving through it. We see that the Russian objective here is to gain control over the road from Svetlikovo all the way to Basilivka, gaining control over the Luknia river line. And once they gain control over the western bank, they may also cross over to the eastern bank to gain control over this area near Svetlikovo and down south, as they continue downwards towards Luknia and Yunakivka to cut off the main highway supplying the Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region. Not only will the Ukrainians be forced to redirect some forces out of the Kursk region to defend, and also from the Sumy region to defend the frontline positions here near the Sumy region, but it will also be limiting the supplies going in and out of the Kursk region, and if the road is completely cut off, it can completely cut off the supplies going into the Kursk region, and this will make it very difficult for the Ukrainians to continue their operations within the Kursk region. Taking a look at the frontline situation, we see that the Kursk region is in extreme danger for the Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainian forces fear encirclements both in the Kursk region as well as in the Kupiansk direction, not to mention the difficulty of the situation in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region, where the Russians are gaining significant advantages compared to the earlier weeks, where the Ukrainians continued their counterattacks and managed to stabilize the situation somewhat. The Russian momentum has been regained, and they are speeding up their advances. On top of all of this, the situation has become much more difficult on the Ukrainian side in the diplomatic parts, where Trump just said a few minutes ago the finance minister's trip to Kiev was in vain. Zelensky makes it very difficult to conclude deals, and Zelensky may not attend peace meetings on Ukraine. According to him, the presence of the Ukrainian president at the negotiations is not that important. I would like him not to go there at all, the US president emphasized. So we see that the current situation with the Ukrainian President Zelensky refusing to sign the deal for the minerals, where the United States will get right for half of the minerals in Ukraine. He's not willing to sign that as it is a $500 billion deal, and he has not really received anywhere near that from the United States. It is a very bad deal for Zelensky, but it is one that he cannot refuse unless he wants to lose the war, and Trump is emphasizing that for Zelensky. If he does not sign the deal, he will not be included in the negotiations, and Trump will really just favor Russia in the situation, where in the latest G7 statement on the Ukraine war, the United States has refused to word the statement in a way that calls Russia the aggressor, and this is against the wish of the remaining G7 members other than the United States. So we see how Trump and the United States has completely switched the script, and now Ukraine is not seen as a victim, but instead as a part of the problem in the Ukraine war, and this has completely switched the situation around for Ukraine. According to Trump's advisors, Zelensky is receiving, quote, bad advice from the European partners, and therefore he is being too aggressive and he's too used to get everything he wants, and this makes it very difficult for him to negotiate with Trump, as Trump is someone who goes tit for tat. He wants something in return for giving something, and he doesn't see this as an equal trade, and Trump gets extremely insulted by the way Zelensky acts, and this has made it very difficult for Zelensky to negotiate with Trump. Therefore, I, in the end, really believe that the war will end in 2025, simply because we are really close to Trump just stopping US aid to Ukraine. US has already refused to send additional packages, so we may see a complete stop of US aid to Ukraine, and with complete stop of US aid to Ukraine, Ukraine could suffer a defeat, a complete defeat, a collapse of the military within 6 months, according to Ukrainian government officials. According to them, the European Union and European countries cannot catch up and give what the US has been giving, and that is simply because European stockpiles are empty, so they have nothing to give. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.